Royal life is often associated with luxury, power, and influence, but for the women involved, there was a serious drawback in the past, for childbirth was often deadly. Across time and space, countless princesses and queens faced immense pressure to produce heirs, yet many died for their dynasties, unable to survive the very act meant to secure their family's legacy. These tragic deaths didn't just end lives, they altered the course of history, changing the planned succession to thrones and in some cases leaving whole nations inconsolable. In this video from History Calling, I uncover over a dozen heartbreaking stories of royal women who died in childbirth, and the unexpected and even world-changing results that came from some of their deaths. These are the women for whom giving birth meant giving everything. Before I start, I should say that there are, of course, a huge number of royal women from a huge number of countries who could be discussed in this video, so this represents just a tragically small selection of those people I could have discussed. Feel free to mention others in the comments if you want to. One other thing I'd like to mention is that when I give years of marriage in this video, I'm referring to in-person weddings between couples, not to the years in which proxy unions were completed, which were sometimes quite a bit earlier. My list will be in chronological order, and we begin with Princess Joan of England. Born in 1165 to Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Joan, also known as Joanna, was married to William II, King of Sicily, in 1177 at the age of 11 or 12. But, having had no surviving children by him, she was widowed in 1189. Her brother, Richard the Lionheart, later arranged to have her marry Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, in 1196, and she gave birth to their son, named after his father, in July 1197. On the 24th of September 1199, she died in childbirth in Rouen during the kingship of another of her brothers, John. Her final actions were very unusual though, for, sensing that death was coming, she asked to be consecrated as a nun, despite being married and pregnant, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, who was then present, agreed to her desire, despite his reservations, for he believed that she was inspired by heaven. This consecration into the Order of Fontevraud took place in front of her mother, among others, and Joan expired soon afterwards. Her baby boy lived only long enough to be baptized and was buried in the cathedral at Rouen. She was interred in a nun's habit, first at Rouen, then in the nuns' cemetery at Fontevraud. Next, we have Isabel or Isabella of Mar, first wife of Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, though she was not his wife during his kingship. They married in circa 1290 and had one surviving child, Marjorie, born in around 1296 before Isabella's death, seemingly at around the age of 20. Now her cause of death is shrouded in some uncertainty, but it seems like it was probably a result of childbirth. There's some wiggle room there though, I admit. The fact that she died before producing more children and crucially before producing a son would have a profound effect on Scottish, later British history. It left her husband free to remarry to Elizabeth de Burgh, and I never know if it's de Burgh like Edinburgh or de Burgh like Lady Catherine de Burgh in Pride and Prejudice, so you can offer up your opinions in the comments. With Elizabeth, he had further children, one of whom became king after his father, before Marjorie's son took the throne as Robert II, the first monarch of the House of Stuart and ancestor of all Scottish and later British monarchs too. Unfortunately, the next woman on our list is none other than Isabella and Robert the Bruce's daughter, Princess Marjorie. Born in about 1216, she was married to Walter Stuart in 1315 and died at the age of around 20 in 1316. The story goes that she was heavily pregnant with her son Robert when she fell off her horse, causing labour and then her death. There is some confusion, however, as to whether this happened or whether Marjorie lived on into 1317. The fact that her baby survived does suggest that he can't have been very premature, yet the idea of an 8 or 9 month pregnant princess out riding seems preposterous. Perhaps Margaret died soon afterwards in an unrelated riding accident or whilst pregnant with another child. We'll likely never know for sure. She was buried at Paisley Abbey. Before we hear about the other women on my list, if you're enjoying this content and want more from me, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. You can also subscribe to the channel for free and switch on the notification bell to get updates about my new videos. If you're already subscribed, it's sometimes worth checking too that your notifications are still switched on, as they sometimes get deactivated, possibly due to device updates on your phone, etc. You can get more from me by becoming a YouTube channel member by hitting the join button, or by heading over to patreon.com/historycalling to become one of my patrons, for whom I provide bonus material like early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. That's linked below for you, as is my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which you can purchase from Amazon, and my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads by joining my free mailing list. Moving south to England, we come to Mary de Bohun, who I don't have any decent images of, first wife of Henry IV. Born in 1369 to Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, she was married to Henry in 1381. Yes, another girl married off at about 12. Mercifully, the marriage doesn't seem to have been consummated until she was around 14, though that's still shockingly young, and it was only in September 1386 that she became a mother, giving birth to the future Henry V. 5 more children followed: Thomas, John, Humphrey, Blanche, and Philippa, the last of whom was born in 1394, probably on the 4th of July, which was of course also when Mary died, at the age of about 25. She was buried in Our Lady's Chapel in St Mary of the Newark, Leicester. She was never queen, for her husband did not take the throne until 1399, and it was his second wife, Joan of Navarre, who held that title. Slightly overlapping with the life of Mary de Bohun was the life of Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France and second wife of Richard II of England, the man Henry IV would usurp. Now, Isabella was married off to Richard at the age of 6 in 1396 and was widowed at 10 when her husband was likely starved to death, so thankfully that marriage was never consummated. However, she was eventually sent back to her homeland of France by King Henry and later married her cousin Charles, who became the Duke of Orleans in 1406. He was only 11 years old at the time, so it wasn't until the 13th of September 1409, when she was 19, that Isabella was delivered of their only child, a daughter named Jean. The birth killed her, of course, otherwise she wouldn't be featured in this video, and she was buried in the chapel of Notre Dame de Bonne Nouvelle at the Abbey of Saint-Lamar, now known as the Church of St. Nicholas. Her remains stayed there until they were rediscovered in 1624 and moved to the Orleans Chapel in the convent of the Celestines, Paris, but her grave was later destroyed at the time of the French Revolution, and so nothing remains today. To learn more about her, see my video all about her life. It's linked on screen and below. We now circle back to Princess Philippa of England, who Mary de Bohun had died giving birth to in 1394. She grew up to marry Eric VII, King of Norway, Sweden and Denmark in 1406, although the phrase grew up is applied very loosely here, as she was another child bride who'd barely seen her 12th birthday and was only 11 at the time the proxy wedding had taken place. Tragically, she died on the 5th of January 1430 after delivering a stillborn son, and was buried in the cloister church at Vadstena, Sweden. Next, we come to one of the best known women on my list, because she's one of 3 Tudor queens to appear on it. I'm speaking about Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII and mother of, among others, Henry VIII. Born in 1466 to Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, she married Henry in January 1486 and bore him 7 children, of whom only 3 outlived her. It was after the death of their eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur, in April 1502, that the king and queen decided to try again for another child, for which read son, to shore up the Tudor family line, which was then hanging by the thread of their younger son Henry's life. His 2 other siblings were both girls, so they didn't really count as potential heirs. Elizabeth quickly became pregnant once more, and in February 1503 she gave birth to another little girl named Princess Catherine in the Tower of London. Tragically, both died almost immediately, with Elizabeth passing away on her 37th birthday. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, where her husband later joined her. I have videos about her childbearing record and the death of Arthur, which I'll leave linked for you, But something I get asked quite a bit is, how do I think things would have been different if she'd lived? And the answer is that I don't really know. Her son Henry would still have become Henry VIII, but perhaps with his mother there, he might have been a slightly different personality. Perhaps not. She wasn't a miracle worker after all, and even had she lived into the 1530s, when Henry was dumping his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in order to marry Anne Boleyn, she might have been powerless to stop him. Henry, after all, developed a reputation for not caring when he was hurting his family members, so it's maybe a bit hopeful to think that his mother could have reined him in. Moving on to Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, born in around 1508 and married to the king in 1536 after he'd executed her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. It took a little while for Jane to conceive, and the evidence suggests that this was probably an issue on Henry's part, but she did so at the start of 1537 and was delivered of a son, the future Edward VI, on the 12th of October that year. At first, all seemed well. But Jane soon began suffering from what was termed childbed fever, and on the 24th of October she died at Hampton Court Palace. She was buried in St George's Chapel at Windsor, where Henry was later laid next to her, as were Charles I and one of Queen Anne Stuart's infants. Now, had Jane lived and been able to produce another surviving boy, things could have been very different indeed, as that second boy could have inherited the throne after Edward died at the age of 15, and we'd never have had Mary I and Elizabeth I. Henry VIII's final 3 wives would also likely not have married him and had very different lives. So Jane's death had far-reaching consequences, and I'll leave my video on her death and burial linked for you. The last Tudor queen to die as a result of childbirth was Henry VIII's 6th wife, Catherine Parr. She was born in around 1512 and was married 4 times, making her the most married queen in English history. She had no recorded pregnancies, though, until she got to her final husband, Thomas Seymour, brother of the long-dead Queen Jane, who Catherine scandalously married in around April 1547, mere months after the death of King Henry. By the beginning of 1548, she found herself pregnant, and on the 30th of August she gave birth to a daughter named Mary at Sudeley Castle. Tragically, like Jane Seymour before her, she quickly succumbed to childbed fever and died on the 5th of September. She was buried 2 days later in the church at Sudeley, and her body was later dug up multiple times and terribly mutilated. I'll leave my video on that, which is one of my most popular episodes, linked below for you, along with one about what happened to her daughter, who disappears from the records as a toddler. Had she lived, perhaps her husband Thomas Seymour wouldn't have lost his head the following year after a botched attempt to seize control over his young nephew, King Edward VI, but we'll never know. To Spain for our next royal lady, who actually has the same name as one we've already looked at. This is the second Isabella of Valois on our list, though you'll also see her called Elizabeth, and that's what I'm going to call her going forwards to avoid confusion. She was the third of the 4 wives of Philip II of Spain, who was already the widower of Mary I of England, and was born in 1546, growing up in France alongside her future sister-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots. She married Philip in 1560 when she was not quite 14, and it would have been earlier had her own father not died in 1559 and delayed her travel plans. She had originally been intended for Philip's son, the mentally unstable Don Carlos, but thankfully for her, that marriage didn't occur. She had 2 failed pregnancies, followed by 2 daughters born in 1566 and 1567. Her final pregnancy ended in 1568 when she was just 22 years old. She had been ill since the middle of September, suffering faints and fevers, and on the 3rd of October she miscarried and died, according to her devoted husband, who was by her side, quote, after a stillbirth an hour and a half before of a girl of 4 or 5 months, who was baptized and went to heaven with her mother. Elizabeth's demise would have profound effects on the future of Spain, as her stepson Don Carlos was already dead by this point too, and King Philip was left with no male heirs. He therefore had to marry again, this time to his niece Anne of Austria, who finally provided him with a surviving son, albeit one who was, as was common with the Spaniards at this time, badly inbred, and perhaps this is part of the reason their other 4 children died young. Had Elizabeth lived, though, she might have been the mother of the future King of Spain. To Germany next, to look at the death of Anna Petrovna, Duchess of Holstein-Gottorp in 1728. The daughter of Emperor Peter the Great and Empress Elizabeth of Russia, she was born in 1708 and married Karl Friedrich in 1725. They travelled to Kiel in the summer of 1727, by which point Anna was in the early stages of pregnancy. She gave birth to her only child, the future Peter III of Russia, on the 21st of February 1728. Like so many before her, though, she contracted puerperal fever and died on the 4th of March, aged only 20. Her remains were taken back to Russia, and she was buried next to her parents in St. Peter and St. Paul Cathedral. In the very historically inaccurate but hysterically funny TV show The Great, which is about her daughter-in-law, Catherine the Great, Anna's adult son is played by Nicholas Hoult. She is represented as having been a tyrannical mother who even drowned a young member of the family, but with whom Peter is obsessed, to the point that her mummified body is kept in a glass case because he refuses to bury her. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth, as the real woman died when he was only a few days old. The next person on the list was born a Spanish infanta, but died a French dauphine. I'm speaking about Maria Teresa Rafaela of Spain, born in 1726 to Philip V and married to Louis, Dauphin of France and the son of Louis XV in 1745. It was to be a short union. Their only child, a daughter named Princess Marie-Thérèse after her mother, was born on the 19th of July 1746, and 3 days later the Dauphine died, aged only 20. The little girl lived less than 2 years, dying herself on the 27th of April 1748. The effects of the Dauphine's early death were, in hindsight, profound. With no son, her 16-year-old husband had to remarry less than 5 months later to produce an heir, and ended up fathering the ill-fated Louis XVI by his second wife. Had Maria Teresa Rafaela lived and produced a boy, perhaps the entire French Revolution would not have occurred, and her daughter-in-law, Marie Antoinette, would just be a footnote in history, having never been the Queen of France. I imagine you've never heard of the next lady on the list, but you'll have heard of her grandson, I guarantee it. She was Duchess Louise Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, born in 1779 and married to Augustus, hereditary prince of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg in October 1797. On the 21st of December 1800, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter named after her, and 10 days later, on New Year's Day 1801, she died at the age of 21. Her daughter Louise grew up to marry Ernst I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and was a mother of Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, making Duchess Louise Charlotte the immediate ancestor of the entire current royal line, and at least ensuring that she didn't die for nothing, as so many other women on the list, whose infants didn't survive either, did. One of the most significant maternal deaths in British history was that of Princess Charlotte of Wales. Born in 1796 to the future George IV and his hated wife/cousin Caroline of Brunswick, she was their only child and the only legitimate grandchild at that time of her grandfather George III. This made her second in line for the throne for her whole life, and quite the catch on the royal marriage market. She wed Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, later Leopold I of Belgium, on the 2nd of May 1816. After an early miscarriage, she became pregnant for the second time in January or February 1817. There was concern about how big she was getting. She ate a lot and did very little exercise apparently, and the size the child would be at birth, which led to her doctors putting her on a tight diet and even bleeding her in the later stages of the pregnancy. Probably not a good idea, as it weakened her. On the 3rd of November, she went into labour about 2 weeks later than expected. After 2 days, during which her attendants barely let her eat anything, weakening her even further, it became clear that something was seriously wrong, and it was only at 9 p.m. that night that she managed to expel a large stillborn baby boy. At first, she seemed to be on the road to recovery. However, within a few hours, she began vomiting, complaining of abdominal pains and bleeding. In the early hours of the 6th, she died. Britain lost its mind with grief and a strong dose of fear as well. With both the 21-year-old princess and her son gone, they were faced with an impending succession crisis after the deaths of George III and George IV. The result was that Charlotte's bachelor uncles were motivated to finally get themselves honest wives in place of their mistresses and produce legitimate children. One such uncle married Charlotte's sister-in-law, Leopold's sister Victoria, and in 1818, barely a year and a half after her death, Charlotte's cousin, Princess Victoria of Kent, would be born as a result of this royal baby race. And the rest, as they say, is history. For had Charlotte or her son lived, the entire royal family as we know it today wouldn't exist. I'll leave my episode all about that baby race linked for you. Royal childbirth losses were becoming more and more uncommon as the 20th century approached and medical science improved. But the worst could still happen, as Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark discovered in 1891. Born in 1870, she married her first cousin once removed, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, in 1889 and bore him a daughter in 1890. In September 1891, she was heavily pregnant with their second child when tragedy struck. The Grand Duchess, as she was by now termed, was staying with her in-laws when she went for a walk along the bank of the Moskva, something she did regularly. There was a boat permanently moored there, which she always jumped into from a little bridge rather than taking the path to it. On this day, she did exactly the same thing, but fell as she landed in the boat. The next night at a ball, she went into labour, brought on, it is supposed, by the fall. Am I the only one who thinks going to a ball in her condition, especially after a tumble, was also unwise? Her son Dmitri was born prematurely, but survived. His mother was not so lucky. After 2 days in agony, she died at the age of 21. Her husband was absolutely distraught, and when she was being interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, he had to be held back by his brother Sergei when the coffin was being lowered into the tomb, or he would have gone in after her. Her remains were later moved to Athens in 1939. I hope you find that list interesting. In an effort to leave you on a more positive note, I'd like to finish by pointing out that royal maternal deaths are almost unheard of nowadays, thankfully, and modern medicine has proved able to get modern women and their children through dicey situations that might well have killed their forebears. The current Princess of Wales, for instance, had terrible morning sickness in her 3 pregnancies, a condition called hyperemesis gravidarum, which is thought to have killed the author Charlotte Bronte, but she and her children are fine. Meanwhile, the current Duchess of Edinburgh survived an ectopic pregnancy in 2001 and later a placental abruption with her daughter Lady Louise, who had to be delivered early by emergency C-section in 2003. I think both of those conditions would have killed Duchess Sophie less than a century earlier, but she and her children are all fine. So the days of somewhat frequent deaths for royals and other women in or shortly after childbirth are thankfully behind us in the developed world. Let me know in the comments which of the women's deaths mentioned in this video you think had the biggest impact on history. And to hear how childbirth wasn't actually as dangerous in the past as this episode may have led you to believe, watch my video on maternal mortality next. Or you might prefer to learn about Catherine Parr's death and burial and the disappearance of her daughter. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.